We all know leadership isn't always, smooth sailing, right? They
Yeah,
are going to be storms.
absolutely.
And so that is exactly what we are diving into today.
Right.
Leadership in crisis. We have got some really fascinating material here, all focused on understanding how to steer through the really tough times.
I think that is a perfect way to frame it. Think of this deep dive as a way to gain a more refined perspective on these really critical junctures. Because a crisis, and all the material really dives into this, is a pivotal moment. The actions that you take as a leader can actually fundamentally alter the trajectory of an organization. It's going to determine whether it emerges stronger or, faces significant hurdles.
And the sources that we are looking at for this deep dive really underscore that. You think about some of the big global events that have happened in recent history, like the 2008 financial collapse, the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic. These were these huge events that tested organizations in really profound ways. And I think what became really clear is that effective leadership in those moments wasn't about having all the answers already prepackaged, right?
Right.
It was about that capacity to navigate deep uncertainty with skill.
I think you are spot on there.
Yeah.
And to really understand how to do that, I think it's important to just take a step back and define what we mean by crisis in this context. Because it's more than just, a dip in performance or a minor setback.
Right.
The material we have looked at really emphasizes that a true crisis is a significant inflection point,
Right.
and the stakes are substantial.
Yeah, substantial stakes indeed. The potential outcomes that are laid out in these documents are pretty major. We are talking about the survival and the future prosperity of an organization versus, the very real possibility of failure. So I guess with that understanding of what a crisis is, let's dive into those essential qualities that make leaders so effective when the pressure is on, right?
Yeah, and one thing that I thought was particularly insightful in all this material is this consistent emergence of these core leadership traits.
Okay.
It seems that no matter where you look, there are three key characteristics that are consistently highlighted as just vital in these moments.
Yeah.
And those are clarity, adaptability, and empathy.
Let's start with clarity.
Yeah.
Clarity in a crisis. I mean, it seems intuitively right. When everything feels chaotic and uncertain, that need for clear and concise communication seems paramount. And I think the source material offers a really interesting and compelling illustration of this. They talk about Jacinda Ardern's leadership during the pandemic.
Yeah, it's a great example. I mean, her approach during that period really exemplifies this idea of clarity. And the
Yeah.
material points not just to her transparency,
Yeah.
but to how she achieved it. The consistent use of plain language in those daily briefings, coupled with an acknowledgement of the emotional toll that the pandemic was taking on the population. I mean, that was just informative. But it also fostered this real sense of shared experience. And I think that's a really powerful element of clarity in a crisis.
That's a great point. The how behind the clarity. It's not just what you are saying, but how you are saying it.
Exactly.
And I think that leads us really naturally into that second core trait, adaptability. Because as we know, no matter how clear your initial communication is, a crisis rarely follows a predictable path.
Right.
Things evolve,
And
and often very quickly.
yes, absolutely. So the ability to just embrace flexibility and execute these swift pivots is absolutely essential.
So important.
And the sources that we looked at, they highlighted the importance of scenario planning before a crisis even hits.
Cool.
Yeah, so it's not just about reacting. It's about having some frameworks in place where you've considered different potential outcomes and pre-assessed, possible pivots.
Wow.
And then you can really move quickly when something unexpected happens. Leaders need to be willing to adjust business models, adopt new technologies. I think that agility piece of finding new avenues forward, even in the middle of all this turmoil, it's so key.
Yeah.
It's about not being rigidly attached to the original plan, right? You have to be willing to see those emerging opportunities, even as everything around you is changing.
Yeah, that makes sense. You could have the clearest vision, but if you don't have the ability to adjust when things are changing around you, it's not going to carry through.
Yeah.
So we have talked about clarity, we have talked about adaptability. And the third core trait that the material spends a lot of time on is empathy. And this one feels particularly critical in a crisis when people are already under immense stress.
Absolutely. Because at the core of every crisis are people, right? These are your employees, your customers, your stakeholders. And they are not just seeking solutions. They're looking for reassurance and a connection on a human level. And the material really underscores how crucial it is for leaders to acknowledge the human impact of the crisis,
Yes.
to really connect on that emotional level. And this isn't simply about being compassionate. It's a really fundamental way to cultivate and maintain trust when it's most vulnerable.
Right. When people feel understood and when they feel like their concerns are genuinely being acknowledged, it creates this psychological safety,
Yeah.
which is so important for navigating these tough times, collectively. So we have explored these core traits: clarity, adaptability, and empathy. But the material goes deeper than that, right? It actually delves into some really practical, tactical approaches that leaders can employ in the midst of a crisis.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, moving from those foundational traits into more concrete actions. And the sources we've looked at point to several actionable strategies. One that stood out to me was the critical need to focus on priorities.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, being in the midst of a crisis, it must be so easy to feel overwhelmed by the sheer volume of issues that are coming at you from all directions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The material stresses the importance of identifying and concentrating on just the 2 or 3 most critical areas that demand immediate attention. It's about resisting that temptation to tackle everything all at once.
Right.
It's more about being strategic.
Yeah.
How do you allocate resources, your time, your team's energy, your financial capital, to those key priorities that will have the most impact? Think of it like triage for your organization.
That laser focus seems absolutely vital.
It really is.
Now, another tactical approach that I thought was really interesting that they highlight in the material is the need to overcommunicate, which sounds a little bit counterintuitive. You think about it and you think like, am I going to overwhelm people? Am I going to be constantly repeating myself? But when you think about the reasoning behind it, it makes a lot of sense.
Oh, it does, because the material emphasizes this fundamental human need for information, especially when things are uncertain.
Right.
Anxiety thrives in a vacuum.
Yes.
And so your role as the leader in this situation is to communicate what's happening, not just once, but to reiterate it. Make sure the message is received, understood, and that everyone is really on the same page about the current situation, the direction forward, and their role within it. And I think that this constant reinforcement builds confidence and reduces anxiety.
So important. Alignment is key. And I think the final tactical approach that we should discuss from the material is this idea of empowering your team. And this is more than just delegating tasks to, take things off your plate.
Definitely. The material actually frames this as a crucial strategy for leveraging the diverse expertise that already exists within your team.
Okay.
It's about placing trust in your people, giving them genuine ownership in developing solutions, and fostering that sense of collective problem solving.
Right.
Which not only boosts efficiency, but it also significantly enhances morale and engagement, precisely when they are most needed. When people feel trusted to contribute meaningfully, they are more likely to really rise to the occasion.
Absolutely. You are recognizing that you, as a leader, you don't have all the answers. But that collective intelligence and the ingenuity of your team, that can be a powerful asset for navigating a crisis. Now, to really kind of solidify these concepts, the source material provides some really insightful real-world case studies.
Yeah, these examples offer these invaluable insights into how these traits and tactics actually show up in the real world.
Exactly.
So the first one examines Ford Motor Company during the 2008 financial recession.
Well, yeah, a period of immense, economic instability.
Yeah.
And the material highlights how Ford managed to actually avert bankruptcy. And that was a fate that unfortunately befell some of its competitors.
Yeah. And what is really interesting is that they placed emphasis on this proactive restructuring and also this clear commitment to long-term sustainability. And so the leadership style of CEO Alan Mulally is really cited as being key here. His focus on transparent communication and cultivating this collaborative environment across the company, I think that was a really critical factor in their survival and eventual recovery. And it's such a great example of how those core traits that we discussed earlier really come to life.
Totally. And then that second case study brings us much closer to the present. It's about Airbnb at the very onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And obviously the impact on the travel industry was immediate and really devastating.
It was. I mean, the material describes this almost instantaneous and dramatic collapse in bookings. And CEO Brian Chesky was forced to make these really difficult decisions to significantly reduce their workforce. But what really stands out in this example is the way he approached those layoffs.
Yeah, with so much empathy.
So much empathy. It wasn't simply a matter of cutting costs, right?
Right.
It was about recognizing and addressing the impact on those individuals. And The sources detailed how Airbnb offered these really substantial severance packages, and they went above and beyond to provide personalized support to help those departing employees find new opportunities, which, is a really powerful illustration of leading with empathy, even amidst these really, really difficult decisions.
It's really remarkable. And I think, both of those case studies, even though they are very different contexts, they both powerfully reinforce some key lessons that emerge from the material for leaders who are navigating really turbulent times.
They really do.
And one of the most powerful statements I think that came out of all the sources is this idea that a crisis doesn't build character, it reveals it. And it makes you think, what does it really mean?
Yeah. It really gets to the essence of what leadership is all about. The material underscores that during those really high-pressure moments, your fundamental values just rise to the surface. And it's in the decisions that you make, the way you inspire and guide your people, and the core principles that you uphold, that your lasting legacy as a leader is forged.
That's powerful. So ultimately, what the material seems to convey is that effective crisis leadership isn't about having all the individual answers. It's about having the clarity to communicate effectively and honestly. It's about having the adaptability to navigate unforeseen challenges. And it's about that deep empathy to connect with and empower your team to find those answers collectively.
Exactly. It's about skillfully guiding the collective intelligence and that inherent resilience of your organization through the storm.
So the learner, that brings us to the close of our deep dive into this topic of leadership in crisis.
Yes.
It has been a really insightful exploration of the characteristics and those practical approaches that define effective leadership when the stakes are incredibly high.
Absolutely. And as you reflect on the material, I think it's really interesting to consider those leaders that you admire. How did their actions in moments of challenge really reveal their character?
Right.
How did they leave that lasting legacy?
Yeah.
And perhaps even more important for you, the learner, what steps can you take now in your sphere of influence to better prepare yourself and your team for those inevitable future crises?
Something to think about.
Yeah.
Until next time.
See you then.